So we're going to go over how to create this really pretty and light and kind of more delicate floral watercolor appearance here. So I know that oftentimes I just dive into, let's ditch the pencil and just go for it. But this one has a lot more form to each of its petals in the sense that they're all treated individually as we create our flower. So the first thing that we'll want to do is draw our flower out, and you can do this using a reference. I will walk you through a little bit of how to create these petals, but for other reference, be sure to check out either my books or my Skillshare classes, because they're going to give you a lot more in-depth look on how to actually draw the petals themselves, because we're going to be focusing more on painting this. So to get started, I'm just going to create kind of a base that's a C curve. We're going to want that a lot lighter too, so make sure that you aren't going crazy. I can't find my eraser, so I'm going to use the back of this, but ideally you'll want a side eraser. It's fine. Okay, so real light, I'm just going to use that as the base because I can see. And then I'm going to create some texture on the top part of this. So when I create texture, it's kind of a wobbly line, but I'm going to do it to where it is only coming downward. So basically your line is going to look like, rather than looking like this, it's only dipping downward. So like this is its baseline. And the reason for that is because it's just showing texture at the petals. So it's as if this line is the petal, but then its texture is just pushed in there. So that's how we create that. So this one, I'm doing a similar look to this, but I'm actually creating it more forward facing. So I'm gonna create some petals that are kind of in a circle here, and they're going to wrap around. And as I do that, I'm creating some texture, but I'm creating them really close together and really skinny, and that's going to be the base of the center. So again, I'm just C curve and then a little bit of texture inward toward the C curve as I'm working around. And then make some of these real skinny. And then as it gets toward the outside, that's where I can start enhancing the petals and having them get a little bit larger. So suddenly now my texture is going to be on the outside, and that's kind of showing that instead of being tucked in, the petals are now blooming outward. And so I can do a soft curve here, and then the texture is on the outside, and then I can get that a little bit larger. A little bit larger here. I'm gonna also soften this. Again, if you need references for drawing, be sure to check back to my other classes on Skillshare. All right, so I'm continuing here. Just a few more on the outside, and these ones are going to be less textured. And then the last thing I want to do here, I do need to find that eraser, because now I want to drag it along the entire page, because that way it will keep my guideline, but it's going to, here we go, it's going to lighten it enough to where those hard eraser lines, or pencil lines, aren't going to show as much. So just on the side with medium pressure, I'm just going to kind of drag it across here to get rid of the hard lines. So I can still see what's going on there, but it's a lot lighter. And I apologize, I know that on video this won't show up as well as it is in person, so you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit, but hopefully the drawing out part was helpful. Okay, so now I'm gonna go right into my watercolor. So I'm gonna pick a base color to start with, and you can mix your colors, or you can use something that is already a color that you love. I wanna go for kind of a corally color, which I don't have in my palette. I always create these swatch charts for everything that's in my current palette so that I know exactly where they are, because they're not labeled and they don't always appear exactly how they look. They don't appear in their well how they look on the paper, so this is helpful for me. So I'm going to go for coral. I know that that's going to be kind of a pinky orangey, so I'm just going to start mixing in my well a little bit and see what I can come up with to try to make that happen. And it might not happen perfectly, but that's okay. But the first thing I want to do though is I'm going to start really light. So once I determine what color, like the first color I put down does not have to be anything close to what, well, somewhat close, but it doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to be mostly water. You'll see what I mean in just a sec. Okay, so that's corally enough. All right, so I'm gonna pick some of that up, but I'm also going into my water because this first stroke here in my petals is gonna be pretty light. See, that's even too much pigment. So I'm gonna come back in and dip and then get most of that. So it's primarily water. And if it gets to be too much water, you can always use the edge of a paper towel to just set it down and it'll soak up some of that water. Okay, and then you'll also notice that as I work around this flower, I'm not connecting any of those points because I want each petal to be independent of itself. So if it does overlap, don't go to that petal yet because you're gonna want these to all be separated. You don't want too much white space, but you do want, it's okay if they touch, like you can see these touch, but they were all worked on independently and you'll know why pretty soon. Okay. So this isn't quite as watery as what I wanted, but it really is okay because these are really thin. They're toward the center. And it's going to be darker toward the center anyway to grab attention toward there. But once that's set down, I can add, I'm going to get some more red in here so it looks a little bit more salmony instead of so orange. But now what I'm going to do is bring the attention to just one side here, and this one is going to be kind of hard because these are such thin areas. So like on a larger petal it'll make more sense, but I grab a darker color or just more pigment and then I just set it down on the edge of one area, and then it's going to bleed into the petal, and you just want to let it bleed how it wants to bleed. And you're going to want to do this before it dries. You're not going to want to do it right away because then it's going to bleed throughout the entire thing. So you kind of wait for it to dry halfway and then you see how it just bleeds on its own. So this is where it's too wet and then this is where it's kind of perfect. And you'll just kind of get the hang of that as you work. Okay, so that looks good. And so yeah, you're going to work like this, but it's going to be very isolated. So I'm going to grab more of a salmony color again with, I'm going to make sure my brush is practically empty, not much pigment on there at all. Okay, and then I'm going to create the petals on the outside here. So see, that one's looking better as far as less pigment. And then I'll do one right here. Work around here. And I'm just going to keep going until I feel like the other ones are starting to dry a little bit, because once they start drying, I'm going to need to apply the darker color before they dry, or else this technique is not going to work. Like this one's getting pretty dry, so I'm going to go in with that darker color and set it down just on an edge and let this bleed, as it will. This one's getting pretty dry, so I'm going to make sure that gets in there. There we go. And this one is pretty wet because I just set that down. So you might be tempted to spread this out. It just depends on how it wants to dry, so just give it a second because the bleed sometimes is pretty unpredictable and sometimes it turns out awesome. So don't force it, because if you force it, what ends up happening is it takes away the technique and then ends up looking just kind of flat. Okay, so now I'm going to grab more of a salmony color again, push it in here. And it looks like I'm getting a little bit too much white space. So what I can do is either connect one of these, and when I say connect one, I mean this one right here that's in the same row, or I can fill it after it's dry with more petals. So I really recommend checking that because you don't want too much white space in there. All right, so I'm working on, see, like that one bled because I accidentally touched it. So you really want to be careful of that. It's not the end of the world, but if it's like one or two, but you do want to kind of maintain the separation. So each petal is its own interest point. All right, so I'm starting to dry on the other one, so I'm gonna get that darker color in here and just add to one side and let it bleed. And I'm using a little more on these larger petals because they can handle it. And then maybe get it pinpointed more on the small ones. And keep working around. Like after a while, don't even have to add any more pigment because the water itself has plenty, and I want this to be pretty watery anyway. I work pretty impatiently, so a lot of times it will be an area that bleeds regardless because I just want to get it. I don't know. Some people can really do patience more than I can, and I envy them for that. All right, so we're almost done here. I'm just going to keep this going on the outside and then go back in and add that darker color. And I might need to pick a little bit more up if it starts to look too watery, because I really do want that to make a good emphasis. See, like that one, it was almost too dry, but it ended up working. Okay, so you can see this one, it's kind of dry in here. I'm just gonna kind of help it along a little by pushing it inward a little bit. But overall, I'm gonna let these kind of do their own thing because I know that I've had it happen too many times where I try to force it and then it doesn't have the effect that I want. But I will, for some of these that I see are drying, maybe add a little bit more because it's done its bleed and it's not as concentrated as I want it to be. Okay, so now that that's done, I can go back in to the center and add just some interest with little mark making, and then hit that. And I went darker on purpose because then when I put the bleed color in, it just really brings the emphasis toward the center rather than being too flat. And when you bring the emphasis toward the center, then you have more of a focal point. Okay, so as you can see, that is bleeding well. If you notice that you have a lot of white space in here, like I said, go back in. You can go back in with water, or you can go back in with that original color and just fill in a little bit toward the base, toward the previous layer of petals. Try to keep some white space if it's still wet. Otherwise, wait for the previous, like the inner petals right here to dry before you add more, because otherwise you're gonna have a blob, which is what we don't want. All right, and then if you want to come out on the edges and just kind of smooth those out real softly so that they have a little less jagged edges and a little more flowy, then you can do that too. So I know it's hard because we're watching some of this stuff dry and we have to wait, but I promise you, just wait and then the turnout will be beautiful.